was it. Thank you. We're done. Lovely to be here. I hope you don't mind, but I'm going to speak in English because I don't speak Spanish. My interest in education dates back to when I was at school myself. I wasn't planning when I was at school to get involved in education. I wasn't planning anything when I was at school. Can I ask you, how many of you are doing now what you thought you'd be doing when you were in high school? No, one or two. I'll ask you about that in a minute. You see, most people have no idea. And even if they have an idea at school, it doesn't work out that way. I mean, you may think, well, I definitely want to be, you know, a writer or a lawyer or a technician or a chef or whatever you want. You may have this idea at school, and some of you may go on to do that. But even if you're doing what you wanted to do, and it's a minority of people, you still can't plan the life you have actually had. This is a really crucial point to me because every human life is unique and unrepeatable, and every human life is improvised. Our lives are a constant process of creative decisions and improvisation. So when I was at school, I didn't know what I was going to do. I had no real idea. I was a member of a large family. I have 5 brothers and a sister. One of my brothers is here, John. We're traveling together. And at the age of 4, we grew up right next door to Everton's football ground. You know, there are 2 soccer grounds, football grounds in Liverpool, Everton and Liverpool. And we grew up right next to the ground, and my father thought that I was going to be a soccer player by the age of 4, because he'd been one, and I was very fit and agile, and apparently had a kind of precocious talent. It was a bit like Ronaldo. It's a common comparison. Common comparison. But in the 1950s, there was an epidemic of polio, which was in Europe and in America. And I got it at the age of 4. So I was in hospital for about a year, and that was the end of my father's ambitions for me to be a football player. So when I went to a school for kids who were handicapped, and then I remember there were 2 people who kind of crossed my path. One of them was a fantastic man called Charles Strafford, who came into our school one day. There were only about 8 of us, no, probably about 10 of us in the room at the time. I was 10. And this man came in, he was visiting the school, and he talked to me and then a few other people, and then he went and spoke to the teacher. And then a little while later, I was asked to go and see the head teacher of the school, who I'd only ever spoken to once. And this man was sitting there with him. It turned out that he was the inspector for Liverpool for special education. And he'd spoken to me, and he thought there was something, he saw something in me, you know, that interested him. So I was given a series of tests at the school. I now know that there were IQ tests, and I was moved up a few classes. This man, Charles Strafford, became a friend of our family, and a patron of me. We were a big working class family. And I got into the hands of another teacher called Miss York, who was very demanding. And because I worked with her, I passed the public examination to go into the ordinary schools, to the grammar schools. And I was on my way at that point. I was the first person from that school ever to pass what was called the 11 plus, to go into mainstream education. And it was because 2 people saw something in me and demanded it of me that I should develop it. And then I went into a kind of regular school, and I went on to into education, and I did a lot of work in English and theatre, but I still didn't know what I wanted to do. But I'd always been struck by the fact that people of all ages have many more abilities and possibilities than routine education ever allows them to discover. All children are born with immense capacities, but I always feel that the human talents are like the Earth's natural resources. You know, they're buried beneath the surface. You have to discover them, and you may never discover them. I mean, you all have talents you're probably not even aware of, and you may never discover them for lack of opportunity. I mean, for example, I was thinking linguistics is a good example. Most children learn to speak in the first few years of their lives. And interestingly, nobody teaches them how to do it. If you're a parent, you know that. You know, you did not teach your child. How many of you got children? Okay. Well, you know, if you've got children, and in the first few years, they start to speak, do they not? But you don't teach them. Not in the sense that we think of you don't sit them down at the age of 2 and say, we need to talk, you know, or more specifically, you do. And this is how this works. They just take it in. How many of you speak 2 languages? 3? 4? That's pretty good. I think that's what happens. If you learn a couple of languages when you're growing up, your facility continues. Most people, if they're exposed to 3 or 4 languages in their childhood, will just learn them. You don't have to be linguistically gifted to learn several languages if you learn them as a child. You just have to be a human being. And we all have that capacity, but most of us end up speaking 1 or 2, or if you're English, 1. Yeah. I try to speak French in France, and people just stop me. Don't do that. That's horrible. Stick with English. You can do that. So, but it's the same with musical instruments. If you're exposed to music at an early age, you'll learn instruments. If you're exposed to design, if you're encouraged to dance, if you're encouraged to build, you know, we all have a vast array of talents. It's about whether or not we identify them and then cultivate the skills that are necessary for them. And I've always felt this from a very early age. I felt it about my peer group at school, I mean, in a half-formed sort of way. And then I got very involved at college in theatre. And I always thought theatre was a very powerful way of getting people to connect, communicate, and explore, you know, their relationships with each other. Theatre is the art form of human behaviour. And in theatre, the questions people ask are not what do you think about this so much, but what do you do in these circumstances? How do you feel? How do you act? How do you behave? What does it mean for your relationships with people and the actions that result? And it interests me that this was not being used very widely in schools, despite the fact it was clearly very important as a way of connecting and learning. So I kind of wandered into the things I do, but it was always driven by a belief that people had more talent that was being uncultivated than they knew. And I knew it from my personal experience, that's the point. And the more I got into it, the more outraged I became by it. For me, this is a human rights matter. You know, that we all have one life that we know of, and it's, you know, relatively short in the cosmic scheme of things. And very many people spend their lives not feeling very fulfilled, or feeling purposeful, or feeling they've really discovered what they are authentically capable of achieving. And this is important because this relationship between nature and nurture is highly dynamic. And one of the processes on which we depend for cultivating our natural sensibilities and talents is education. So I began with an interest, particularly in an art form, and I got quite involved in thinking about it. But then it seemed to be the whole array of disciplines in schools need to benefit this way. And then latterly, I became interested in the idea of creativity. And the reason for that is that there are very few things that set us apart from life on Earth, and I think we make far too much of the differences. But something does, clearly. Other species don't behave as we do. We behave as they do, very often. But there are things we do that they don't seem capable of. I mean, they don't come out and sit in theatres surrounded by cameras. You know, they don't wear clothes that somebody else has designed or that they've made. They don't go in for cuisine. in quite the way we do. They don't speak language. They don't seem to have theories. They don't have value systems. They don't form competing cultures. They don't build economies. They don't build great civilizations. We do. But in every other respect, we're just like them. We're mortal. We're fragile, dependent on the planet and what it gives us. But what is this thing? And to me, it's captured by the idea partly by the idea of creativity. We have powerful imaginations, and with that, when we harness our imaginations to practical purposes, we create virtual worlds that we live in. So to me, creativity, the concept of creativity and the practice strikes right at the heart of what it is to be a human being. And it's, to me, increasingly important that we cultivate these capacities in our education systems, which have long neglected them because of our common humanity, and also because we have now, through these powers, accidentally created all kinds of challenges to ourselves which are existential in character. And to me, there's nothing bleaker than listening to political debates about improving standards in schools and doing more testing and having more examinations, and when the great agenda that we face as human beings is being left untouched by most of our education systems. So the more I've got into education, the more interested I've become, not just in the theory of it, but the practice of it. So when I showed up at TED a few years ago to give a talk, there was quite a long background to it. And that particular talk, some of you may have seen it, was in 2006. And it's been seen now, it's been viewed online about 53 million times.
57 million.
57, well, I was up all night doing this. So, is it 57? Is it, yeah. But it gets shown to groups, so it's probably some multiple of that. And I think the reason it's taken off is because I think people recognise there is a common sense to it, and it's true. And the other thing is it's been seen in 150 countries, which is the important thing. It's not just a product of a particular cultural perspective. So, in short, like most of us, I have created my life. I didn't plan it out. I've tried to control it. I've tried to bring some sense of purpose to it. But there have been some guiding principles. One of them is a belief in the fundamental goodness of humanity. One of them is a sense of our abundance as people and things we're capable of. And the third is how vital it is that our public institutions cultivate these talents for ourselves and for the common good. The last thing I just want to say about this is that I'm very conscious in all the work I do that these debates have been continuous. One of the most important educators in our recent history is Maria Montessori. And many of the things that she talked about in early years education, but she's an example of somebody who wrestled with these issues in the very difficult circumstances of working class children and developed a series of practices which are resonant with the natural rhythms of human growth and development. She's not the only one. The whole progressive movement was based on the ideas of trying to address the whole child and create conditions for growth and development. And this was true in the kindergarten movement, Freiburg, not just Montessori, and the rest. John Dewey, in the 19th century, wrote a great deal about education and personal development. He also wrote a lot about democracy. And he once said that democracy has to be rediscovered by each new generation. It's a very important observation, that, to me, that all of us tend to suffer from a kind of cultural amnesia. We have debates as if they'd never happened before. It's like, my kids believe that the millennials discovered sex. When I know that the boomers discovered it. I was there that weekend. I lived, by the way, through the sexual revolution of the 1960s, as you can see. And I missed it, actually. I didn't go out that weekend. But I could see there was something different on Monday when I went to work. But my parents, they claim to have invented it too, so who knows? Who knows who invented sex? But a lot of these core principles of what it is to live a good life, how democracies work, how people need to become engaged in not just their own lives, but in the common good, these go right back to ancient times, to the beginning of our civilizations. But each generation has to rediscover them. It's a bit harder to discover them these days because we're so distracted by everything else that's going on. But I look at what's happening in the United States just now. the country that proclaims itself as the leader of democratic principles, when I lived there, I've lived there for 17 years, and I can tell you this is a bit of an exaggeration. And there's never, to me, been a more important time to engage properly with the core purposes of education. I mean, there are four, I think. Education has economic purposes, it has social purposes, it has cultural purposes, and it has personal purposes. And for that, we need an expansive conception of how education works, and we need to recognise that none of that will happen if we don't invest fully and properly and resolutely in the training, development and support of teachers on whom this whole enterprise depends. So to me, these issues aren't becoming less important, they're becoming more important as we go on. Any thoughts, comments, observations, questions?
Hola Ken, buenos días, soy Laura, soy futura maestra y me gustaría preguntarte que cómo recuerdas tu etapa en la escuela y que si tuviste algún gran maestro que te cambiase la vida.
You know, hello Laura. Did you all understand that? Well, I mentioned a couple of the teachers I had. It's hard to exaggerate the importance of teachers in your life. I mean, teachers, show up. It's one of the most demanding jobs I think anybody can do, in a good way. But it's so multi-layered, and it really has always annoyed me that people who don't work in education find easy ways to be critical of how teachers do their job. And, if you're faced with 20 or 30 or more lives for 40 minutes or an hour, and then they go, then you have another lot. It depends if you're in elementary or high schools, but then you have another group come through. These are all people living lives of hope and expectation, but complex lives. They're bringing all the agendas from home, from the street, from the culture around them, into the classroom. This is just a moment that you're sharing with them. So to be a good teacher, it involves all kinds of things. One of them is, clearly you need to know the material. I say that, you don't always need to know it. Depends what it is you're doing. Years ago, I did an event in Vancouver. It was a peace summit. It was called the Vancouver Peace Summit. Hey. Sorry. Anyway, the guest of honor was the Dalai Lama. So I was hosting the opening session, and there were, I think, 10 on the panel, including the Dalai Lama, who was sitting on a throne. I requested a throne today. It's a cheap production, I'm just saying. Cheap. So the Dalai Lama was fantastic. And at one point, he was asked a question. He was asked lots of questions. There were 2,000 people in the room. So he was asked a question, and he got very thoughtful. He was, say, sitting cross-legged, and he closed his eyes and was quiet for what seemed like a long time. A bit too long, I thought, because I was hosting the meeting, and I didn't know what was going on. I thought, has he become enlightened? Don't do that now. Not today, or not before the coffee break. Anyway, we've got another 40 minutes. Anyway, no, seriously, he's been very thoughtful, and then he's very funny too, by the way. He's got a very impish sense of humour, but anyway, he was asked this question. It was about philanthropy or something. And then he took a breath and we thought, here it is. This is going to be great. And he leant forward, and we all leant forward, and he said, I don't know. I thought, well, that's disappointing. Yeah. I thought, what do you mean you don't know? You're the Dalai Lama, Anyway, he said, I'd never thought of that. He was saying this to the audience. He said, what do you think? See, what I loved about that was two things. One, that here's one of the world's greatest teachers, the leader of one of the oldest faith traditions in our history who's quite prepared to say, I don't know. And what it illustrates is, and we spoke a bit about it afterwards, there are some things he absolutely knows. He's the world's leading expert in some areas of understanding, but he doesn't know everything. Nobody knows everything. You cannot. Human knowledge and understanding is a densely woven fabric, and we all know some part of it. Some of us know more than others, but nobody knows more than a fraction of what's available. That's one of the reasons that human culture has become so successful. We are a highly collaborative species, and we're able to encode our understanding and share it in multiple forms, in music, in art, in dance, in literature, in all of these different ways. We're not each of us born again into an empty void. We're heirs to the whole course of human history if we have the sense to connect to it. So he's just being honest. I don't know. That's outside my experience. And I think it's very important because teachers these days feel themselves under pressure to be the person who knows. And it's a perfectly honourable thing for a teacher to say, I don't know, and not to pretend you do know. I mean, socially, we're all a bit under pressure to pretend we know things we don't know. You know. But the second thing was, and it was just a very small thing, he said, what do you think? And it just indicated that, you know, learning isn't a monologue. It's a relationship, it's a conversation. And the great teachers to ancient times knew that learning progresses by dialogue and conversation and interaction. That the great teachers are students, and the great students are teachers, all at the same time. So to be a great teacher in a school, I think that's part of it. You have to understand that you're in a relationship. You're not just transmitting things you know to people who don't know. You're a catalyst for enhancing everybody's understanding. There are things you need to know. I mean, there wouldn't be a lot of point hiring me to teach Spanish. You know, it's better you know it. There's a limit to learning by discovery, you know. But a great teacher knows their material, and they know the limits of their understanding. But great teachers are also great facilitators. There are plenty of people who have deep specialist knowledge who are not good teachers. If you doubt that, walk through any major university, and there they will be. Now, I know that because I worked in universities for years, and there are some brilliant teachers in universities, and there are some people who teach because that's the price they pay for doing their research. And it doesn't follow that because people know their material, they're going to be a good teacher. So to be a good teacher, you need to also practice the art of teaching. Properly conceived, it's an art form. Knowing, it's like being a great doctor. You have all of these resources, ideas, techniques, and strategies. It's knowing what to apply here and now with this person. Like being a great therapist, you know, what would be the right thing here? So my great teachers have kind of demonstrated that. Now, some of them were at college, but one of the first teachers who really impressed me, apart from the ones I mentioned, I had a French teacher, and I just loved this teacher. It's Mr. Evans. It's a long story, but I grew up in Liverpool in the 1950s and 1960s, and there was a time when Britain was apart from the rest of Europe. You know. Strange to think of it now. But there was a time when Britain didn't really want to be part of Europe. And but I mean, anybody of my generation, you know, if you went to England in the 60s and 70s, it wasn't, I mean, it was always a good, interesting place with its own culture, but it wasn't European in the sense it's now become. So when I was growing up, you know, one of the things I was impressed with Mr. Evans was he could speak French really well. You know, and that wasn't true of most French teachers. You know, it was something they had to do. He was chic and kind of suave, you know, and he smoked Gitane cigarettes. And he'd had garlic. This is in 1964. I mean, I thought garlic was a drug. Yeah, I still do. So he was into French in a big way. He was European. And there was just, when he came in the room, something came in with him, a whole sensibility. And we just sat and listened to him. You know, he didn't have to do anything. We just paid attention. And because of that, I learned French and got interested in it. I had a Latin teacher who just really impressed me. But it's a relationship, that's the point. You don't have to like them, they don't have to like you, but there has to be something about a teacher that interests you or impresses you. And you know, a good teacher lifts you up, just like a bad one will knock you down. I mean, I can remember teachers who just, by raising an eyebrow, made me feel terrible. You know, you ask a question and they make you feel ridiculous for having asked the question. It can put you off that subject forever. You know, you bear a heavy responsibility. You need to carry it lightly. But teachers are immensely influential, and my life is peppered with great teachers like that. And you will be one.
Soy Mar Romera, soy maestra y yo creo, soy optimista y creo que vamos a cambiar el mundo a través de la educación. Y necesito el mejor de los consejos del mejor gurú, que es usted. Y quiero saber si tuviese el poder de cambiar el sistema educativo, ¿qué cambiaría y por qué?
Okay. It's true, by the way. Let me preface this by saying that people often feel that it's impossible to change the education system. And I think it's important to understand what sort of a system it is. You see, it's not a mechanical system. There are some systems which are built to do something and they just do it predictably. It's not an inert system or one that just runs on algorithms. It's a human system. It's what theorists call a complex adaptive system, meaning, you know, it's made up of multiple elements. You know, like a simple mechanical system is like a lever. That is an example of a simple mechanical system. You know, a bar with a pivot closer to one end, which amplifies the effort you put into it. An aeroplane is a complicated system. It's made up of millions of simple systems, but it doesn't change itself at the moment. You know, aeroplanes don't have feelings about where they're going to and think, I don't want to go to Karachi again. That was a real downer. You know, they don't do that. They just do what they're designed to do, hopefully. Human systems are different. Human systems are made up of, like the education system, it's made up of literally hundreds of millions of people in hundreds of thousands of organizations with countless interests, countless points of interaction with each other. And so it is highly complex. It's made up of individual actions every day, and they're all fluctuating. There are dominant features of the system and how it works, but it's a vibrant, dynamic system, even when it doesn't appear to be. Secondly, it is constantly changing. There are some things which seem to be perpetual, but even then, taken over time, there's a big change. There's also a lot of room in the system for innovation. You can do several things with education, with human systems. You can make changes in the system. A lot of what goes on in schools, for example, in our countries, isn't required by law. It's just what people have got used to doing. It's habit. For example, in most school systems, there's nothing to stop teachers trying new ways of teaching. My wife used to teach in Liverpool. She had 42 kids in her class. They were 10-year-olds. And the classroom she was in was like an Aladdin's cave. And the reason is she got them all working together all the time in groups, kept mixing them up and people say, how can you teach 42 kids all day? Well, you don't. You get them to work together. You teach them together. Her school became a very interesting place because the head teacher encouraged collaboration between all the different teachers. So they worked to their strengths. Head teachers can do that. It's not required by law that they have to keep to the ordinary trodden path. You can make changes to the system, in the system. You can make changes to the system. You can campaign for changes. You can get out of the system and go to an alternative school. But my point is there's more flexibility and the system is changing. And it's changing partly, this is the optimistic bit, because there are disruptive forces happening around education. One of them is I'm going to talk about this later on, but there's a mounting problem of unemployment among young people. You know, the promise of education is being broken every day for tens of thousands of kids. And that's a big and unsettling energy that's building up in our communities. The promise of higher education is failing many kids. I mean, when I was in higher education, the idea was if you worked hard and did well and got a degree, you had a good job. People know that's not true anymore. I don't mean it's never true, but it's not a guaranteed truth in the way it used to be. We also know that we're about to face a massive wave of new developments in digital technology and artificial intelligence, which is in all likelihood going to start to erode many jobs that were thought to be uniquely the province of human beings. So we're living in a world of constant flux and change. This is before we even begin to talk about the climate and what's happening in our national political system. So the system is flexing. It is changing. It's resistant to some changes, but there's a lot of change going on. So you've got some various options, really, in this, I think. One of them is, and I think it's an important principle, that if you work in education, then you are the system. You and everybody else. It's not about saying, well, everybody else has to change. What you do is part of it. If you have a classroom and the door closes and all those kids turn around and you get their attention, what happens next is the education system. For them, they don't care who the Minister of Education is. You know, they don't care who PISA is. They've never heard of Andreas Schleicher. They don't mind. What they know is you and what you do next. And what you give them to do, what you ask of them, the way you respond to them, is education for them. So I always say the starting point is you. You know, it's Gandhi, isn't it? Be the change you want. Be the change you want to see. And then work, if you have the energy and the effort and the will, with other people in the school to see if they want to see some changes too. Work with parents if you can. You know, be clear about the sorts of changes you think are important in education. Clearly there are big problems, but you know, it's like with the environment. You know, there are big vested interests to keep things as they are, but it doesn't mean that there's no room for change. I mean, look at the Me Too movement at the moment. That's been having, because it's kind of ignited a tinderbox of anger and frustration that people have known were there, but it needed something to create that spark, and that's beginning to have a big impact. So I think that's just the first thing. You know, there is room for change if you have the will to do it, a determination to try and see something shift. It doesn't have to change the whole world, but what you do for your kids does change the world for them. A raised eyebrow can change the world for the kids you work with. And I think it's important never to underestimate that, you know, your power as a teacher in a school. And if it all gets too much and you just can't be doing with it, do something else. I really mean that. You know, I mean, I'm not asking people to desert the education system, but you have to make your own call on this. You know, it's your life too. I always feel it's important, you know, it's the old thing, you know, put your own mask on first. You have to refresh yourself. You know, if you feel this is draining you, you need to do something else for a bit or find some way of balancing that out. I wrote a book a few years ago called The Element. It's in Spanish.
Yes.
I should now speak Spanish. It's called El Elemento. There we go. So, but one of the ways that people, it's about how when you know you're doing what's most authentic, you know, doing the thing that resonates with you as a person. Terry, my wife and I, we travelled to Paris last week. And we were just saying, you know, I've always long thought this, I do not know how politicians do it. You know, on airplanes all the time, showing up, being taken from meeting to meeting, you know, cameras put in their faces, microphones, every word they say being weighed. You think, who would do this? But what's clear is they love it. And that's an important observation for me, that if you're doing something, you know, being in your element is two things. It's finding things you're good at that you also love to do. If you love something you're good at, well, you know, you never work again, as Confucius said. But you know you're doing something you're meant to do or is right for you for a couple of reasons. One is, for example, you find that time changes. You know, if you're doing something that you love, you know, an hour can feel like 5 minutes, can't it? You look up and you think, where did that go? If you're doing something you don't care for, 5 minutes feels like an hour. You know, you look at the clock and you think, when is this going to move? The other thing is that being in your element, if you're doing things you love to, you get energy from it. There's an important difference to me between spiritual energy and physical energy. And you know what I mean by that? You can be, I mean, I don't mean spiritual in the religious sense. I don't not, but I mean in the sense in which you're in high spirits or low spirits. You know, you can do an activity that you love. You can be physically exhausted and at the point of collapse. Look at people doing marathons. They keep going till they cross the line, and then they keel over. But you can be, you know, less dramatically, you can be doing things that that exhaust you physically, like I'm wiped. But you can be buzzing with it. You know, your kind of heart's pounding, you're exhilarated by it. Equally, you can do things you don't care for. You can be physically fine, but completely down and desolate. And what I find around the element is if you do something you love to do, it doesn't take energy from you. You get energy from doing it. It charges you up spiritually that you're doing it. And it's true of activities. It's true of people. Don't you find that? I mean, there are some people that give you energy. Like just hanging out with them, you feel better. You know, you go to work and you see people coming towards you, you think, fantastic, they're here. You know, you light up. And equally, you might see someone else coming towards you and you think, really? What now? You know, can we reschedule? You know, because they just suck energy out of you. And we know that. It's just the way it runs. So I'm saying, I'm not talking to you directly, I'm just using the opportunity to say it. Teaching is a physically very demanding job. It's emotionally a very demanding job. And on the best days, you're exhilarated by it. You know, a lesson might have gone really well, some encounter with a kid, something you plan to do just really worked. But then there are a lot of things that teachers do which are enervating. You know, all the administration, all the testing, all the dealing with problems that come up every day. And you have to look at the balance of that. You're on balance. Is this feeding me? You know, or isn't it? And, or did it used to, but it doesn't now? And I just always want to say to everybody really about if you have the choice to do it, that if you continue to love it, keep doing it. But if you need time to do something else, or you need to give yourself time to be somewhere else, then you should try and do that, you know, within the realms of what's possible. I mean, I found that if people change track, it can happen if you move to a different age group. I mean, teaching isn't homogeneous. I know people who love working with little ones, and they couldn't bear to be in a room full of teenagers, and other people are the exact opposite. They know exactly what to do with 30, 15-year-olds, but give them 10 3-year-olds and they're completely lost. They don't know what to do about that. So it's all of that. So I think they're the layers of it. It's about looking at what your situation, and then if you feel capable and in a position or have an appetite for bigger social change, get involved in that too.
Hola Ken, mi nombre es Jorge, soy músico. Parte de tu trabajo, o casi todo, versa en torno al concepto de creatividad. Curiosamente, hay mucha confusión, hay mucha gente que no lo entiende bien, ¿no? Y tú además dices que la escuela mata la creatividad. Así que la pregunta sería, ¿qué es para ti creatividad?
I don't know. Actually, what's your name? George. George, I never said schools kill creativity. But when I did the talk at TED, they put a title on it. And the title they actually put on was, Do Schools Kill Creativity? With a question mark. They did change it a while later, and I got them to change it back, because I'm not saying all schools kill creativity automatically, it's unavoidable. What I am saying is that schools don't cultivate it in the way that they should. And if it's not cultivated, it tends to dissipate. So I think you're right to say that people are often confused by the idea. I, in the late 90s, chaired a national commission in the UK on creativity in education for the government. And I remember that we had a national literacy strategy in the UK. And I and a lot of other people believe we also needed to have a creativity strategy, for reasons we can talk about later if you'd like. But the government asked me if I would put together a commission. So I got together a group of about 15 people to help me put together a plan and a practical strategy to promote creativity in schools. Let me ask you, if you were doing this, if you were to get together 15 people to become advocates of and practical strategists for creative education, who would you have in your group of 15 people? I mean, don't think about, well, you may think of particular names, but what sort of people, what categories of people would you have on a group like that? What, children? Yeah? Or childish people? No. It's not. Go on. Artists, teachers?
Madres.
Mums, yeah? Sorry?
Inventores.
Inventors?
Abuelos, grandparents.
Emprendedores.
What was that one?
Grandparents.
Grandparents? Entrepreneurs, yeah?
Psicólogos.
Psychologists?
Emprendedores. Mothers.
Mothers? Not fathers? Any more?
How about people with disabilities?
Yeah? Yeah. Why?
Because I think people with disabilities, they face different challenges and adversity every day. So maybe they are finding different ways to, to go around, basically.
Yes. Yeah. I think that's a good, well, what's your, do you like the word disability? You okay with the word disability?
It's the best word I can use in English. I mean, I learned English just 4 years ago, so.
Oh, really? Where are you from?
I'm from here, from Spain.
Yeah. So what's your disability?
I'm blind.
And were you born blind, or were you?
No, I became blind when I was 8 years old.
Right. Was that an accident, or how did it happen?
Oh, no, just a disease.
Yeah. So was it progressive or sudden?
Suddenly, 5 seconds.
Really?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. What was the disease? Do you mind me asking?
A glaucoma.
Right. And it happened that quickly.
Yeah, because they touched my retina.
Okay. Yeah. So it's literally like throwing a switch.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. The reason I ask you is because the Secretary of State. Well, firstly, I went to a special school as a kid, as I mentioned earlier, and
Yeah, me too.
so well, then we had kids with all kinds of apparent disabilities. I say apparent for a reason, but there were kids with polio. There were quite a few of us. Kids with cerebral palsy. Blind kids, partially sighted, deaf, people with heart problems, asthma. It was quite a collection, really, of people. And what interested me was there was one kid I sat next to for several years who had cerebral palsy. Cerebral palsy is a terrible thing to deal with because it's caused by, usually by a damage to the brain, a brain lesion of some sort. And like with every other form of physical disability, it doesn't follow that there's any kind of mental or emotional impairment. It's just it's a motor issue. And in his case, in cerebral palsy, what happens is that, in order to do something simple like extend your arm like that, some muscles have to contract and some have to relax. And the net effect of some of these brain lesions in the motor centers is that it doesn't coordinate like that. So the muscles that are meant to relax aren't, so it's uncoordinated. So you're fighting yourself the whole time. You can't get the message through from the brain directly to the muscles to behave in the way that other people find natural. Well, you can imagine, too, that if that affects the muscles of your face, to speak involves a highly complex dance of the facial muscles. So if they're not coordinating, then your voice is muffled, and often you're drooling, and you would as well. It's like when you've been to the dentist, if all your muscles suddenly get paralyzed in your face, or don't. So it's a terrible thing for people with it, because it sounds as if they've got some major mental problems as well, which they may, in all probability, not have. Anyway, this lad who sat next to me his arms were all crunched up, and he couldn't hold a pencil. But he could hold a pencil in his feet, between his toes. So he used to bring his leg up and would write with a pencil grip between his toes. He had very good writing. It was better than my writing, honestly. I could never work out whether this was handwriting, foot writing, but he was good at it. But the reason I mention it is because all the people that I knew there did not define themselves by the disability. It was just something they were dealing with. I'm sure, I don't want to presume in your case, but it wasn't that they were saying, I'm deaf, that's everything you need to know. They were also deaf. Interestingly, among the deaf community, there is often a culture of a particular sort, because there are sign languages. One of the markers of a culture is that there's a distinctive linguistic code, and they have one, or they have several. But it isn't that if you, as you did, I'm sorry, what's your name again? What's your name?
Enamed.
What?
Enamed.
Enamed.
Yeah.
It isn't that that's, I guess in your case, it's not that that's all you need to know. I'm blind, that's all, what else can I tell you? It's just something you're having to deal with. But you also have to deal with all the other stuff people are dealing with, like being a person, getting a job and working. And some things are just much more difficult, obviously, and so you have to give more thought to it. And I'm sure you have emotional feelings around it too. As a kid, it didn't bother me that I had polio. It didn't really. It was a nuisance, but it wasn't as if it was stopping me doing something I wanted to do. And for most of my life, I didn't use a cane. That's kind of a relatively recent thing. It didn't bother me. I was a lot fitter then. I was much more agile. I hitchhiked all around Europe. It wasn't a thing. It's not like I wanted to do the Tour de France. I didn't. Even in the best of circumstances, I wouldn't have done it. But all the people I knew, they have complex interior lives just like everybody else does. And the trouble often with the disability issue is that people are being defined by it. That's all we need to know about you. Presumably that's the big thing in your life, and it may not be. There may be something else entirely that's on people's minds. And absolutely what's true is people have all kinds of other abilities beyond the one that's attracting people's attention. I think one of the issues is that for people in special needs education is that our system as a whole has a very narrow view of ability. It's defined largely in terms of linguistics and mathematics. It's because we have such a narrow view of ability that we end up with such a big conception of disability. But if you have a more generous conception of ability, then what are perceived disabilities take a different place in the constellation of things that people are capable of doing. The other thing is, I have not found anyone in my life yet. Maybe somebody here, but I don't know. I haven't found anyone yet, professionally or personally, in my life, that doesn't have special needs. Everybody does. Everybody. Sometimes you can see them. Sometimes it seems obvious what it might be. It may not be that at all. It might be a gender issue. It might be an ethnicity issue. It may be an emotional issue to do with their own background, the way they're being treated, relationships they're in. It may be something to do with their own conception of their own abilities themselves, some obsession about their appearance. You name it. You read novels. You know what I'm talking about. Everyone has stuff. Everybody has stuff to deal with. And the problem, I think, with special needs very often is that people are corralled into one setting and put into this general category that they've got, that what defines them is the disability. Actually, I was involved for a while in the disability arts movement. And, there are fantastic, it's what you were saying earlier, that there are some fantastic examples of the way other abilities become highlighted and developed in ways they might not otherwise have been had it not been for the need to focus in some particular way. The other reason I'm struck by your example is that the Secretary of State that we had in England at the time I did this commission was blind. He had been Secretary of State for Education. He had been born blind, to a single-parent family in an industrial town in the north of England. He didn't realise he was blind until he was 4. He had no idea. That's an interesting thing, isn't it? That if you've never been sighted, he was unaware that he wasn't. It's just when, by the time he was 4, he became aware that other people were doing something that he wasn't doing. And it took him a long time to figure out what it was. He still doesn't know what sight is, because he's never had it. But he went on to be the Home Secretary of the country, one of the leading politicians in the cabinet. Of course, he had to keep up with all the paperwork like everybody else did, so it's an immensely complex issue. Anyway, in his case, we had this national literacy strategy, and I thought we needed a creativity strategy. Now, I remember this guy at the time saying to me, and he commissioned the report, he said, of course, the problem with creativity is you can't define it. Now, I remember saying to him, no, I think the problem is you can't. So we set out to define it. Now, we had on this group artists, visual artists, designers, neuroscientists, economists, business leaders, a full range, and we had consultations all across the country. The reason I asked you the question earlier is because there are misconceptions about creativity, and I wanted to address them in the composition of the group. You see, if you ask people how creative they are, a lot of people will say they're not very creative. And the reason is, adults, the reason I think is that what they think you ask them is, are you artistic? And so they think, well, I don't play the guitar, or I don't do this, or I don't paint, or so no, I'm not very creative. And my point is that creativity is a function of intelligence. And you can be creative at anything at all that involves human intelligence. Science, mathematics, design, engineering, relationships, running a business, anything. Anything that involves using your intelligence is a scene of potential creative work. So to me, there are 3 terms: imagination, creativity, and innovation. The imagination is where it begins. It's the ability to bring into mind things that aren't present. And so far as we can see, human beings have that in a much greater abundance than any other creature seems to have. Because with imagination, you're not locked into the here and now. You can anticipate, you can reflect, you can step outside, you can speculate, hypothesize, make suppositions. Creativity is a step on. It's putting your imagination to work. It's applying your imagination. And the difference is, you can be imaginative all day long, but to be creative, you have to do something. It's a practical process of bringing something about. And it can be a new mathematical theory, it could be anything that's within the compass of human invention and ingenuity. So we defined it in this way, that creativity is the process of having original ideas that have value. The process is important because more often than not, it's a process, not an event. I'm sure you know that as a musician, if you're composing, it's unusual. It happened to Mozart a few times, but it's unusual for the whole thing just to come out unchanged. More often than not, all creative processes are draft. It's constant drafting. And you often end up with something that's different from where you began. The finished product is not always what you intended. So it's a process. It's about originality. It doesn't have to be original to the whole world, but it has to be new to you to count. If you look at a 5-year-old's drawings, then it's original in the sense that they've never done this before. This is pushing their boundaries. But you can't reasonably compare a 5-year-old's drawings to the roof of the Sistine Chapel. It wouldn't be fair, would it? To drag a child to Rome and point at the ceiling and say, check this out, and don't waste my time. And it's about value. Creative processes involve critical judgment constantly. So we set out to look at how that mapped onto different areas of the curriculum and what it meant for teaching and learning for pedagogy. So the misconceptions are that it's about the arts. It isn't. It's about everything. A second is it's about special people. It isn't. Everybody has creative capabilities. And the third is there's nothing you can do, you're creative or you're not, and that's not true. You can help people become more creative by understanding how it works and acquiring the skills to do it better.
Hola, mi nombre es María Luisa, es un honor. Soy madre de una niña de 9 años y me pregunto, si un día mi hija me dice que quiere dejar de estudiar, ¿cómo lo enfoco? ¿Qué le diría usted?
I would have to know your 9-year-old to answer the question. We have 2 children. They're not 9 anymore. Our daughter's 29 and our son is 34. But we had to raise them, and like all other parents, particularly for the first one, it's not at all what you expect. It's a constant process of improvisation and trial and error. And there's a balance to be struck here, isn't there, between providing the space for development of your children. Do you have one or more? Just one. To allow them the room to grow and develop as the unique people they are. And anybody who doubts that, the kids are all different, hasn't had children. The idea that children are born as a blank sheet of paper is nonsense. I mean, children's personalities start to express themselves from the moment they're born. Our 2 children they love each other, they are alike in lots of ways, they come from the same gene pool, they're raised in the same house, they overlap, they have a deep affection, but in many ways they couldn't be more different. I'm one of 7 kids and we're all different, alike in some respects, but totally different in others. So you'd have to know your child and why she wants to leave. I mean, did she want to leave school or that school? The other thing, though, about this as a parent is that part of the role, I believe, there's a big debate about all of this, but it isn't just about giving them freedom, it's about setting boundaries. And also recognizing that in some ways, you do actually know more than they do about some things. And there is a tendency sometimes, I think, I don't know you, so I'm not saying it's true of you, but I know it from where we live in Los Angeles, for parents to become overindulgent of their children and believe that whatever they say is just, we just have to take this like we know nothing. They're 3 and they know much more than we do, or frankly they don't, about everything. And part of the care of duties of a parent is to try and make your best judgment about what's in their best interests. Doesn't mean you're always going to be right, but you'd have to weigh it up in the proper way, and that's one of the great responsibilities and challenges of being a good parent. It's not just trying to be their friend all the time and doing what they say they would like to do. I know that. I think of my own parents, and I would not have focused on my education had it not been for the pressure of my parents. I didn't want to do it. I was at school, even after all I've said, but this was in Liverpool in the 1960s. The Beatles were playing down the street. I didn't want to be at home doing Latin. John and I, one of our other brothers, Ian, is in a rock band. He was rehearsing in the next room to where I was doing my homework. It's the last thing I wanted to do. But it turned out to be, parents do also, one of the roles of a parent is to try and take a longer view than a child can reasonably be asked to have. Because you have the advantage of having lived longer and seen more and having some sense of deferred benefits that may not be apparent to them when they're young. That doesn't mean you ride roughshod over them, but it's part of the art of being a parent. I published a book this year. It's called You, Your Child and School, about this very thing, how do parents handle their child's education. This book, by the way, is terrific. I'm just saying. You should buy this book. In fact, go now. No, but it's about that. It's about different parenting styles. So you can't answer, I couldn't answer that question. But as a generality, I'd say that there are situations in which children may know what's best for themselves, and sometimes that's exactly true, and other times where they don't. It's part of the emotional maturity, that over time, in proper circumstances, our emotional impulses start to be leveled out by our sense of planning and constraint, and sometimes things that kids want to do are simply not in their their immediate best interests. And so getting that balance right. By the way, one of the areas of education I've become very interested in, I talk a bit about it in this new book, is democratic schools. And also alternative schools like Summerhill and, well, the whole range of other ones. But schools in which young children themselves have a central and active role in running the school, where they work together to make decisions. In places like Summerhill and some of the democratic schools, not just about school rules, but about hiring and firing staff. But they are, centrally and in an executive way involved in the management of the school. And what you find then is that if you seriously involve kids, if you give them actual power in the school rather than a tokenistic voice, even from a very young age, they exercise tremendously sensitive collective judgment. I've been to these schools. There's a wonderful book by a friend of mine called Jerry Mintz about democratic schools. There's a whole network of schools in Israel run or founded by a wonderful man called Yaakov Hecht and his wife Shirley. And these schools demonstrate all the time that kids are capable of very sensitive, profound assessments and judgments if they know they have a responsibility and it rests on them to get it right. But what happens then is you have, and from a very young age, but that sort of collective decision-making, that sort of collective checks and balances, counter-argument and counter-argument, that they're very capable of achieving, is a different sort of process than a single child being irritated and frustrated by their circumstances and wanting to know if they can get out of it. That's all part of the complexity of childhood. So saying that you have a role as a parent isn't to say that children need to be told what to do all the time and that we shouldn't give them more responsibility. But if you don't know about democratic schools, and I'm sure some of you do, but some of you may not, I would definitely look at them because I think they're the future.
Mr. Robinson, mi nombre es Francisco Mora, Medicina Complutense, aquí en Madrid. Empezamos a conocer el papel importante de la emoción en los procesos cognitivos del cerebro. Mi pregunta es, ¿qué reflexión le merece el valor de la emoción sobre el aprendizaje y la memoria en los estudiantes y en la enseñanza en los profesores? Muchas gracias. Es un placer tenerle aquí con nosotros.
Thank you. One of the problems, I believe, in our education system, broadly speaking, is that certainly since the 18th century in Western thought, we've allowed, a schism to open up in our thinking about intellect and emotion. And we think of these things as unrelated, and that intellect is about reason, logic, and evidence-based judgment, and that feelings and emotions are somehow disruptive and they're to be contained. It's why, since the birth of psychiatry in the late 19th century, most of the effort and most of the literature for most of the time has been focused on the negative aspects of emotion. And we talk about emotional disturbance, emotional illnesses, psychoses of people being distracted or being tortured by their feelings. Now, this isn't to say there aren't negative emotions. Clearly there are. But you have to weigh against them the great spectrum of positive emotions that drive human community, collaboration, and achievement. Love and compassion and joy and delight and excitement and exhilaration and expectation. These are not separate from human experience. They're what impel us in particular directions. And there's an intimate relationship between what we think of as our intellectual processes and the underlying feelings that drive them. I mean, for example, if you look at what happens in most of our political systems, people of accomplished intellectual capacities will argue from entirely different points on the political spectrum about issues that you would think if we're only driven by reason, they would readily agree. But when you dig down, it turns out that their arguments are driven by feeling, which they're rationalizing. So, if I look at what's been happening in the American elections recently, for example, any reasonable assessment of what's been going on would judge most of these arguments to be baseless and without evidence. But they're argued by reasonable people from an emotional position over issues like race and gender and immigration and all the rest. Not only, but often, commonly. And I think it's very important that we try to reconnect the idea of feeling and knowing. For a couple of reasons. One of them is that feelings are forms of cognition. They're not separate from cognition. For example, our feelings they arise as our evaluations of our relationships to things. So if I were to say to you that somebody had died, perhaps somebody you knew, I couldn't on face value make any call about what your feelings would be. I might reasonably say that if somebody that you know has died, I'm not just talking to you, anyone, that you'd be upset. You might not be. You might be delighted. You might be thrilled that that's happened. It depends entirely on your relationship with them. Whether you like them, whether you dislike them, where they figured in your personal fortunes, what your background experience of them was. It doesn't follow at all. Our feelings are appraisals, they're evaluations of what's going on. And they're affected by what we know of the situation and what we think about it. So, for example, racism, in all its multifarious forms, is rooted in particular perceptions of other cultural groups. What you think of their practices, our fear of difference sometimes. Sometimes it may be merited and sometimes it's not. I worked for a long time in Northern Ireland as part of the peace process, and we had there people from different religious communities who otherwise were the same in every way. They'd been brought up in the same town, similar cultural backgrounds. There was no... if you look at people across the room, they seem to be the same in every respect. But there were deep divides, which often, in a few cases, turned to murderous activities because of how they perceived the ideas and values of other people. The peace process was about recalibrating how people saw each other and what they estimated each other to be and their value. The way to address emotional changes often is to work with people's cognition of a situation. But it doesn't help to marginalize feelings if they don't matter. They clearly do. The good news is that there's been a big move, as you know, in recent years, in the direction of what's now called positive psychology, the positive aspects of feeling, and to recognize that they are a central part of the human experience. But one of the ways I've been very keen to show how these things are connected is to challenge the stereotypes that people have about the arts and the sciences. In schools, for example, it's often thought that science is the kind of rigorous intellectual bit of learning, and that the arts are where people let off creative steam. They can go and express themselves for a bit and express their feelings. And for a while, we've lived with that idea, or it's been promoted, that science is about intellect, the arts are about feeling. And it's a bit like you can do intellect until lunchtime, and then do your feelings in the afternoon. But the fact is that science is highly disciplined, properly thought of, scientific inquiry. The scientific method is meant to be based in reason and evidence. But scientists are highly passionate people. They're driven by intuition, by feeling. Michael Polanyi, in Personal Knowledge, wrote very knowingly about this years ago, where he talked about the intellectual passions of science. That people are driven by a delight in what they do. You don't have to look at the eruptions that break out in the control rooms of the space programs when they achieve their objective, and all that feeling comes out. They're driven by that, and what they try to do is not let their feelings cloud what they're doing, but often it can. The negative feelings may get in the way of that, but the impulse for discovery, the impulse for curiosity, the excitement and passion that drives the scientific process is fundamental to their achievement. And at the same time, you know, they're not bloodless clinicians who go from experiment to a final conclusion. Very often, and Polanyi talks about this, a scientist will have an intuition which is bound up in their hypothesis about what they're about to try and explore. And then they'll kind of backfill it with a method to see if they can see if that's correct or not. And sometimes, like the eureka moment, it's a moment of, you know, as he says, crossing a heuristic gap where you see the solution, but you then have to find a way to see if you can substantiate that. At the same time, work in the arts is deeply disciplined and objective. I mean, you know that. I mean, you watch the hours of study, practice, discipline, application that anybody puts into mastering a musical instrument. If you look at, as I've done, I've worked with dancers for a long time. Used to be on the board of the Royal Ballet. I'm a patron of the London School of Contemporary Dance. So if you look at the rigor and objectivity and a mathematical precision that drives work in the performing arts, these are just terrible caricatures. And it's not to say that, you know, that all of these things, you know, are the same. They're clearly not. But the processes in the arts and science are very similar, just the output's different. And I think that the sooner we can get away from this idea that the feelings are bad, that science is always right, that these are, one process is just rigorous and logical, the others are creative, that one is full of feeling, the other is devoid of it. The sooner we can get away from that and kind of heal this bridge between the Enlightenment and Romanticism, I think we'll have a much more holistic sense of our future as a species.
Thank you.
Hola, señor Robinson. Mi nombre es Eva, soy periodista, escritora y también tengo 2 hijos. Le quería preguntar, además de la creatividad, ¿qué habilidades necesitan nuestros jóvenes, nuestros niños para el futuro que viene? ¿Cuáles serían para usted las 3 habilidades clave para nuestros hijos?
There's a lot of talk about 21st century skills. The thing is, some of the challenges we face now are, without question, they're unique to the times we live in. No generation ever before has been raised in the sort of digital culture that this generation is now living in. I mean, people of my generation kind of moved into the digital world, but you know, we began squarely in an analog world, you know, with TVs and books, and digital culture has changed everything, no doubt, or affected everything, I should say. It's affected. When I gave the talk at TED in 2006, I remember saying there that nobody knows what the world will look like in 5 years' time. You know, you don't have to be a clairvoyant to say that, but it is interesting that the smartphone, particularly the iPhone, wasn't available then. It didn't come out till 2007. And if you think of the impact that the iPhone and, you know, its alternative versions has had in just over 10 years on work, socialization, habits of mind, relationships, it was impossible to imagine it. Even the people at Apple had no idea what they were letting loose in 2007. I know they didn't, because I know them. But all that's likely to be dwarfed by what's about to hit us with artificial intelligence in its various forms. Seems likely to be, anyway. But even so, I mean, so there are some things that we need to learn that are new to our times, but some of the things that we need to have in education are what we always needed to have in education, you know, ancient principles and practices that are just common to humanity. What does seem probable is that the rate of change will continue to accelerate. It'll be as unpredictable, if not more so than ever before. And that the impact of machine intelligence will be to colonize all kinds of roles that previously we thought only human beings could take on. Service roles, roles in the professions, in law, in medicine, in the caring professions. I mean, the likelihood is a lot of those things will be certainly changed, if not actually swept aside. The reason I say it's unpredictable is these things always are. I mean, new technologies have all kinds of refractory effects, and they often generate jobs that nobody ever thought of before either. So it's very hard to say how these things will evolve, but what I do think we can say is that in future what we ought to be focusing on much more are what are the capacities which are distinctively human. And what is it about human beings that we need to cultivate? Since most of the time during the Industrial Revolution, we were focusing on getting people to do things that machines could adequately do now. In fact, we've dehumanized people in order to fit in with the industrial economies, and I think we have to rehumanize ourselves now through education. By the way, if you doubt all this, I'm sure you don't, but it interests me, just going back to the question about feelings and emotions. According to the World Health Organization, the second largest cause of illness among human beings by 2020 and mortality will be depression. Depression. This is at a time when the world is more affluent than ever before. I know the gap has also spread, but if I think of the lives we lead now compared to the lives most people led 100 years ago, and we're living in a fantasy world of abundance compared to then. My parents couldn't have dreamt, of the sort of luxuries we take for granted now when they were kids. But we haven't seen a dividend in terms of well-being or spiritual growth or satisfaction. People are as depressed and angry and belligerent towards each other as they ever were. We're seeing now Europe and America gripped in a populist movement where people are pitching themselves against each other. Again, and we know how that ended last time it happened. And I think the fact is that we are developing more quickly technologically than we are spiritually. Our technologies are outrunning our capacity to deal with them. So education has a role to play here, I think, in trying to ground us again in some ways. So in this book for parents, and also I did a book called Creative Schools, I talked about various competencies I thought we should focus on. Competencies is a word that people are happy to use these days. It means a set of practical capabilities. And I have 8 of them in that thing because I just got carried away. But if I were to pick some out that matter, I do think that creativity, for all the reasons I've said, is important. Kids have tremendous natural capacities, but they need to be cultivated. They need to cultivate them so that they're not locked in to a particular future of their own, so they can have access to their capabilities to create a life that means something for them. But also collectively, we need to have all our faculties about us. We have major problems to solve, locally and globally, and we need to be able to think quickly and adapt ourselves to them. Compassion is a set of capabilities. It's not just having nice feelings towards people. There's a difference between empathy and compassion, I think. Empathy is important, but you know how this is. It's long been said that, that if you hear that a child, in fact, there was a piece in the news yesterday in England, and a very tragic thing. A mother and a daughter, an 8-year-old girl, were walking along the beach in the south of England, and a freak wave whipped up, an 8-foot wave, and when the mother picked herself up, the daughter had disappeared. And she was found later on, but she died. And it's hard to, as a parent, to think of that and not be distraught by it. We all would be. But then, we get news of 2,000 people being killed by a tsunami on the other side of the world, and it's an item on the news. You think, it's not terrible. It's a phenomenon we all have. We have a limited range of compassion. As somebody once said, 1 death is a tragedy, 3,000 is a statistic. And it's very hard for people to move beyond a certain range of emotional empathy. But feeling bad about something or feeling good about something isn't really enough. We need to be active. And so I think of compassion as the practical wing of empathy, it's the practice of empathy. And there are a lot of pressures now which are militating against people feeling those sorts of things towards other people at a time when we really need to. Social media, for example, is having a toxic effect, I think, on a lot of children's emotional growth. Don't you?
¿Cuál es el impacto de Internet, de las redes sociales, del móvil en la creatividad? Yo creo que eso sí que la mata. a la creatividad. ¿No lo cree usted?
Yeah. It can be. In some respects, I always think that social media is a misconception. It's an ironic name because they're not social at all. You know, they're antisocial. And there's a lot of evidence to show it, that kids are feeling very anxious and awkward in ordinary settings because of the whole dynamic of social media is very odd. So that, compassion, collaboration is a very important set of practical skills for people to learn. I'm focusing on skills rather than things they need to, theoretical knowledge they need to have, because education should be much more than sitting down at desks and studying propositional ideas. I mean, philosophers would make a distinction here, and I think it's an important one, between knowing that, knowing how, and knowing this. And knowing that is what we tend to teach in our schools. It's what philosophers think of as propositional knowledge, that something is the case. Historical dates and events and circumstances, the periodic table, things that are readily verifiable as factual or which are kind of are known independently of one person knowing it, but theoretical ideas as well as factual information. Knowing that something is the case. So it doesn't mean it's true, but it's a certain type of knowledge. And that fills up most of our academic curricula. And it's important. But it's not everything. We also need to know how to do things. There's a difference between being able to study a painting in art history and produce a painting. There's a difference between being able to listen to music and playing it. There's a difference between being able to get into a car and be able to strip the engine down. And then the world depends upon practical knowledge, knowledge of how to make things and how to make things happen. Our schools tend not to be very good at that, and particularly because of the emphasis on getting to universities, we've tended to cut away at vocational programs in schools. And they're seen as second tier. So if you go and do a degree in a university, you're thought to be very clever. If you go and do a practical program for a trade, it's thought you're just not as smart as the people who go to university. And the world depends upon people who can do things. and also knowing this, which is what empathy is about. As a human being, what's this? That's what the arts trade in a lot, by the way. Not only that, but also that. This is the nature of this experience and what this means. This is how we experience this thing. So I would say creativity, compassion, and collaboration as the third. The reason I say collaboration is because the emphasis in schools is on competition. And competition has a place, but our communities, our cities, our families, our neighbours depend on people working together. A great city like Madrid is a highly, coming back to what we were saying earlier, is a highly complex and changing system. Every time I get on an aeroplane, I'm reminded of collaboration. When you think of what it takes for that aeroplane to be built in the first place, to take off. I don't just mean the laws of physics, but the massive orchestration of activities, schedules, to make sure the right crew is on the plane, that it doesn't crash into other planes when it takes off, that it gets to the right place in the airspace, it lands, the food's on it, all these things we just glide through and think, it's just that, and we get annoyed if our baggage is late coming off. It's a miracle it's there at all, I think. Human beings are highly collaborative creatures, but we don't teach it in schools. We teach people to compete. And, and this isn't an abstract idea. We just need more teamwork, practical work in schools, which help people to practice working together and learn from each other. And so if I had to pick out three from the antisocial.
Hola, señor Robinson, un placer. Mi nombre es Alicia Bandera, soy psicóloga y madre y me preocupa la excesiva sobreestimulación a la que estamos sometiendo ahora a nuestros niños y niñas para que quizás sean más inteligentes. Me gustaría saber si cree usted que cada vez más las personas son o somos más inteligentes, como dice el efecto Flynn, que cada generación, digamos, que aumenta su cociente intelectual. Muchas gracias.
And I have some anxieties about IQ. IQ has an interesting history. You know this as a psychologist. Just for information, the the origins of the IQ test go back to the late 19th century. And it was a cousin of Charles Darwin who originally got interested in inquiries that became the IQ test. He had become interested in the idea of natural selection in the animal world. And he wondered, this isn't Charles Darwin, it's his cousin, he wondered if something similar operated in the human world. He noticed, for example, that the human world was made up of very successful and less successful people, rich people and poor people, and he wondered if this was because of a different genetic disposition. I think what he overlooked is that rich people could afford to educate themselves and perpetuate their circumstances in ways that poor people couldn't. But anyway, he started to develop these tests. They were eventually elaborated in some form by the French psychologist, I'm trying to remember his name now, who did the work in Paris in the early 20th century on kids with special needs. And basically, it was a series of questions to try and get some objective measure of intellectual capacity and growth. The thing is that the IQ tests have a rather limited range, I mean, classically. You know, they're tests for certain sorts of deductive reasoning, certain types of logical reasoning. But IQ tests typically don't embrace all the things, for example, that are covered by the arts. They don't pay much attention to the things we associate with creativity. But they coincided with the growth of mass education. And so they became handy tools to sort people into different categories for schools. And also in America, they coincided with the growth of the military and the need to select people for the military. So they have an interesting economic and sociological history. But we tend to think, or people often tend to think, I think wrongly, that IQ tests offer some objective, reliable, and absolute measure of how smart people are. So people will say, of course, I have an IQ of this particular number, as if that, again, told you everything they need to know about it. And I've always been skeptical about it. I know a lot of very smart people who aren't particularly good at IQ tests. They're not very good at crosswords either. You know, people can be good at all kinds of things and not good at other things. I mean, I know brilliant poets who are dyslexic, you know, who actually have trouble writing, but they have a wonderful gift for words. I know brilliant musicians who can't read music. So human intelligence is much more textured, isn't it? And complex and nuanced than can be captured in a simple 20-minute test, however many numbers it helps to generate. And one of the interesting examples of it is that there's this idea that IQ tests are going up year on year. Well, I'm not a psychologist. You'd probably have to help us out to understand why that seems to be happening. But the IQ test itself has all sorts of odd things in its history. For example, when people arrived at Ellis Island in America in wartime, in the early part of the 20th century, they were given an IQ test in wartime, and they were assigned to places in the military in America. Sometimes people landed at Ellis Island, immigrants, and were sent straight to the military. They didn't even get to where they were headed. You know, so anyway, they're given these tests, and I wrote about this in a book I did a while ago called Out of Our Minds, The Power of Being Creative. And what was interesting to me about this was that if you scored above a certain level on the IQ test, you'd be sent off for officer training in the American military. If you scored below a certain level, you'd be sent to the infantry. Well, we know what happened to most infantry soldiers, you know, in the First World War, for example. And there was a category on the assessment paper for the military intelligence test when it got the score. It said, if you fell below a certain level, it said, it was a chilling thing, it said, of low military value. Of low military value. Well, you know what that meant. You know, you were machine gun fodder at that point. So the IQ test became literally a matter of life and death for some people. In America, I say America because America has become obsessed with IQ. In America, If you have an IQ score below a certain level, you're held not to be responsible for your crimes. So if you commit a murder, you can't be executed in some states if your IQ is too low, because they'll say, well, you're not competent to be responsible for your actions. Well, there have been several cases, I quote them in Out of Our Minds, of prisoners, in fact, one notable one, who was sent for life imprisonment because he wasn't smart enough to be executed. And he took prison education programs, and over the course of 10 years, his IQ level increased until eventually it crossed the threshold, and he was now judged to be smart enough to be electrocuted. Not quite as smart as he thought, I think, if you weigh it up. But there was a big debate about this. So, what does this mean? Can we now go ahead with the execution because he now qualifies? Well, I say it's a matter of life and death. But if this was some fixed amount of intelligence, which is what some people believe it is and thought it was, that your IQ test is a bit like your blood group, that this tells you how smart you are. If it were that, then it wouldn't improve in one person over time. It shouldn't improve generation by generation, should it? Unless there's something in the water that's contributing to it. Well, what it all points to is that mixed up in all of this are cultural practices, cultural presumptions, and evidence of the adaptability and potential for growth in human minds when they're properly exercised and developed. So I don't know enough about why people believe in the world of IQ tests. The Flynn effect is continuing, but I know it is continuing. And part of my response to it is, can we just take it on advisement? My interest has always been not about whether we get more people to get higher scores on IQ tests, but that we should have a much richer conception of intelligence to start with. Because if you end up with a narrow view of intelligence, as I said earlier, you end up with a big view of inability. And I know all kinds of people who've been hampered in their lives by believing they're not very clever because they were told that at school, or because they didn't measure up against the general standard of what people believe to be intelligence. And outside of education, there's every sort of evidence that intelligence is a much richer conception than it was Francis Binet who developed those tests. He even began to think of. Incidentally, Francis Binet developed the tests, and Charles Darwin's cousin was Sir Francis Galton. He developed those tests in France because he was trying to help kids with special needs education. He wanted to get some measure of where they were in terms of their growth and development. It was the fact they were turned to these mass systems of sorting and filtering that became the problem. I think in some ways it's pretty clear that there is an evolutionary step here. We get better at things that we practice more, so that may partly account for it. What do you think, Billy?
Sobre todo asociado al afán o a la obsesión que tenemos de estimular a nuestros hijos para que adquieran mejores habilidades, destrezas, les exponemos a pantallas muy temprano para conseguir que sean brillantes. Todos esos esfuerzos como que estamos haciendo para medir luego una inteligencia cognitiva, o incluso también les exponemos a aprendizajes mucho más complejos para los que por edad sus cerebros no están preparados. Entonces me preocupa más este hecho de utilizar y medir la inteligencia para que tengamos ese objetivo, ¿no?, de nuestros hijos sean inteligentes en vez de que sean personas con satisfacciones en la vida, o que haya, como ha dicho usted antes, otro tipo de capacidades como la creatividad, la colaboración, la empatía, el sentimiento de elevación, es decir, cosas que quizá son mejores para la inteligencia emocional que este afán para que los niños sepan como más cosas o se les ponga tareas, ¿no?, para que tengan como adquieran mejores conocimientos.
Yeah. I agree with that, and I'm sorry, I didn't answer that second part of the question. I was talking just about the IQ thing because it got me going. But on that broader conception, I do think it's true that, well, firstly, you get better at things, clearly, if you practice them in the right way. And I'm saying that kids have all kinds of capacities that we often neglect. But what's also true is I think that some parents are falling into a trap here of putting their kids under far too much pressure to be good at everything and to do too much. And that's coming back to what we were saying earlier. There's a real balance for parents to strike and to use proper judgment about. I mean, for example, can I ask you, how much time did you, as kids, spend outdoors playing? Just playing. A lot. A lot. Same with me. So I grew up in Liverpool in the 1950s. We'd come home from school and we'd go out in the street and we'd play. Or to the local park for hours. Hours. We didn't like to go home, really. We just went home for food. You know, we were like cats. You know, if there was food, we went back to the house. If not, we'd go to where the food was, to somebody else's house. Children these days don't play like that as much. I'm chairing an international initiative called Dirt is Good, which is about promoting the importance of children's play. We asked 12,000 families around the world, as part of a survey that we've just done, how much time their children spend outdoors playing. And they, on average, and this is true in most parts of the world, kids spend very much less than we did, usually less than an hour, often not anything like an hour. Sometimes none, no time, playing outdoors. At the same time, schools in many parts of the world are reducing time for play. And they're doing it in schools because they focus on competition and testing. And because they think play is trivial, presumably, or somebody does. The reason that children aren't playing outdoors is because parents are often frightened to let them out. It's because they have too much homework that they have to get done. It's because there aren't enough places to play. And also, there's a lot more going on to distract them inside than outside. A lot of kids we found on the survey would rather, for example, play football on a video game than go outside and play football. Well, the reason we have a campaign about this is because play isn't trivial. Play is vitally important in children's growth and development. It's important socially, cognitively, emotionally, and physically. Children have always played, and it's vitally important that they do play for all those reasons. But one of the reasons as well that time is being cut back is because parents are over-programming their children. So when they do go outside, it's often for some team activity that parents are supervising. You know, they're holding their coat and screaming at them, you know, from the touchline, because they want their kids to be more and more competitive. And for all these reasons, I think it's really important that we recognize that childhood is a very important time, and we should allow our kids to be children. I mean, our children now, from a very early age, are suffering from depression, as well as adults. They're suffering from all kinds of emotional disturbances, which are created by the system. Children in schools are being diagnosed with attention problems and given medication for it. In fact, if we just let them go out and play, a lot of these problems disappear. So, I mean, that's part of it. I do think we have to relax a bit around our kids. I mean, I know, for example, we've done the same, you know, to some degree when our kids were young. You try and give them every opportunity. But you never know whether there's a negative return on getting them to do much. I think we should encourage them to spend less time on these devices. I say encourage them. I think sometimes we should just stop them spending so much time. That's part of the role of a parent, you know, like enough. You know, turn it off. But for all those reasons, I think that's the balance to strike.
Hola, señor Robinson. Mi nombre es Ángela, soy profesora de secundaria y trabajo como asesora en una editorial. En los libros analiza las escuelas de hoy, las aulas de hoy y las del pasado. Y me gustaría preguntarle cómo imagina que son las aulas en 20 o 30 años, ¿no? ¿Qué le gustaría encontrar allí?
Okay. Well, I should say right away I'm in favour of schools. I mean, some people aren't. You know, there's a whole movement to get rid of schools and unschooling. But I think schools are very important. I make a distinction in Your Child in School, this fantastic book I mentioned earlier. That's just been published. is great. That one. That there's a difference between learning, education, and school. What I mean is that kids love to learn. Human beings are the most curious creatures we'll ever encounter, I think. We have a granddaughter now. She's 5 months old. And like all babies, she is fantastically interested in what's going on around her. You can't stop her. And she'll just get more curious. That's the big driver of our achievement. Kids love to learn. They don't all like education, and some have a hard time with school. The difference is that education, as I see it anyway, is a more formal program of learning. It's a more intentional program where the assumption is there are some things that we want our children to learn that we don't want to leave to chance for cultural or other reasons. Or there are some things which are too difficult, we feel, for them to find out on their own. So we need to help them. But for those and other reasons, we have formal systems of education, and some people love it and some people don't get on with it. The reason, and a lot of them have a difficult time with school. And the reason, I think, is that sometimes they're required to learn things they don't find very interesting, or they're not taught in very interesting ways. And sometimes it's because our schools don't work with the natural conditions of learning. Like, for example, making people sit down all day, breaking the day automatically up into the same chunks of time, having somebody stand at the front and talk to you, having to do things when you're tired, having to do things with people you don't find very engaging. There are all kinds of ways, and often when you're going through a very difficult emotional time yourself, but you still have to do it, and then the threat of an exam at the end, and if you fail it, you're in trouble. There are all kinds of things about schools and education systems which militate against the appetite for learning. Not always, not inevitably, but often. So the reason I think it's important that we have schools is because, as I was saying earlier, what we learn with and from each other. We don't live in a vacuum. It's important that we see that learning is social and cultural as well as personal. So what I want to do is help to redefine schools and get rid of things in schools that stop people wanting to learn and have more things in schools that make them want to learn, not just on their own, but from and with other people. So you see, if you think of it, if you go back to, as it were, the basics about what is a school, now, we tend to think of schools these days as particular sorts of institutions. But if you forget that for a minute, a school is, at heart, it's a community of learners. People who come together to learn with and from each other. And you can have a school anywhere. You can have a school in a park. You can have a school in your apartment. This is a kind of school. You know, we could reorganize this whole thing if we were staying here for the rest of the day and do this differently. We're doing it now because that's the way this was set up. But a school is people coming together to learn with and from each other. It could be 2 people, 10 people, it could be 1,000 people. So the challenge is not to get rid of schools, it's to reimagine how schools could be in ways that would encourage and cultivate the appetite for learning and feed it properly, rather than, as they so often do now, staunch the appetite for learning and make people lose interest in it, and on the contrary, become antagonistic to the whole process, as some people do. They fall out of school, they just don't finish it, and they think of it as something to be got through and to get over with. So, well, what would that be? Well, if you think of it again, there are some elements you'd want to have. I mean, I think schools need a curriculum. I mean, a curriculum is what it is we want people to learn. Well, again, I think it's perfectly reasonable that we should collaboratively figure out what is it then we want kids to learn these days. And I think a better framework than a group of subjects is to start with this idea of competencies and say, well, what sort of things will help those competencies evolve? And then begin to think, I think, not of subjects, but of disciplines. You see, music isn't a subject in the straight, literal sense of it. It's not just a lot of content. Music is a set of intellectual, emotional, physical, technical, and cultural skills and sensibilities. You know, if you listen to music from a strange culture, one you're not familiar with, you may not make any sense of it at all. I know the first time I went to China, to Hong Kong, and I listened to Chinese opera, I had no idea what they were doing. to a European ear, it sounded like it was just out of tune. You know, it just sounded jarring and unpleasant. But then you don't know what they're doing anyhow, you know. But then you get into it, and then you can see, because this was in a stadium, it's like a football event. People loved it. You know, I just didn't understand the code. Well, music is often like that. You know, so mathematics isn't a subject in the sense it's just a set of propositions to be learned. Mathematics is a highly creative, beautiful discipline with deeply contentious arguments at the heart of it about the nature and structure of mathematics and how it works. And it's a multifaceted set of different disciplines and fields to study. But I'd want to see mathematics, the arts, the humanities, physical education, and languages co-equal and interacting in a curriculum. You think about teaching and learning, that's part of it. It's group coming together to teach and learn. The best schools I know are highly interactive and dynamic, where you have teachers working together and students helping to plan what's going on. You have regular rhythms. For example, in Finland, there are regular breaks in the school day. And every 45 minutes, kids get a 10-minute break, go do something else. They go and run around, they come back. They don't have a problem with attention because they know kids need to get up and run around and be active and busy. In terms of culture, you want it to be highly collaborative. You know, that's why democratic schools are so good. You want a very flexible schedule in a school, so people can drop something and do something else they find more interesting. Much more self-determination in a school. Rather than kids being told to sit down and do something with no choice. There's some things they need to learn, but there should be much more freedom in when they choose to do it and who they choose to do it with. And I say this not because these are theories. I can take and show you schools that are doing it right now. Schools which are reinventing the rhythms of institutional life and getting much better results for doing it. And you know, you want a school where assessment is seen not as a challenge, but as a support to learning, which is what it should be. And the new technologies allow us to do that, by the way, in a much better way. Now we can have portfolios, we can have much more individualized learning plans. I know schools now where kids have their own timetable every day. You know, different, and also mixed age teaching and learning. There's no reason why we should keep kids and teach them by age group. We don't do that in families. We don't need to do it in schools. That's not an educational principle, that's an administrative convenience. It's actually rather inconvenient, but that's why we do it. So if we're prepared to rethink how schools work and look at what gets in the way of learning and replace it with things that facilitate it, we should keep schools, but have them reimagined. And we won't come up with one way of doing it, any more than we've come up with one way of doing music or one band or one sort of restaurant. But they'll all be good if we think differently.